New York has a way of swallowing crimes whole. One day a headline screams, the next day it's fish wrap, and by the third day the city acts like it never happened. That's normal. What isn't normal is when the city agrees to forget. Because in February 1946, 6 men ended up dead on a route so specific, it felt like someone drew it with a ruler, not a random corner, not a random alley, but a long stretch that forced the whole city to witness something without ever saying it out loud. And the weirdest part wasn't the bodies, it was the speed. The speed of the paperwork, the speed of the conclusion, the speed of the silence. 2 days, and the story was sealed with a lazy label that has buried more truth than any shovel ever has. Gang violence. No suspects. No names worth chasing. No follow-up. Just a neat little box checked, like the city was protecting someone, or protecting itself from what the truth would unleash. But Harlem didn't accept the box. Harlem passed. Around a different version, not in newspapers, not on radio, but in barbershops, church steps, back rooms, and stairwells where people spoke carefully because careful speech keeps you alive. And that version didn't start with who died. It started with how the message was delivered, not with gunshots, not with a stabbing, not with something fast. This was slow enough to be intentional, and public enough to be a warning. A warning aimed at people who thought Harlem was a place you could come into, take what you wanted, hurt who you wanted, and walk out untouched. Here's what makes this story dangerous. If even half of what Harlem swore happened is true, then that night wasn't crime. It was policy, a policy written without ink, and the name attached to that policy, the name people whispered like it could summon consequences, was Bumpy Johnson. Not the movie version, not the folklore version, the real kind of man New York produces when the law protects the wrong people and abandons the right ones, a man who understood something the city still understands today. If the system refuses to punish monsters, the neighborhood will eventually create its own punishment. Now let me be careful with what I'm about to say, because this is where official history and street history split into 2 different timelines. On paper, you won't find a clean, satisfying explanation for those 6 deaths. But in Harlem's memory, those deaths were not the beginning of the story. They were the response. The response to something done to one man, a man who wasn't famous, wasn't powerful, didn't own a block, but mattered to the one person you never wanted to matter to. And that's the real hook. Who do you have to hurt to make a man like Bumpy Johnson stop negotiating and start teaching? In the next minutes, I'm going to take you backward to the person at the center of this, the relationship that turned loyalty into obsession, and the one night that made Harlem decide the law was officially irrelevant. Because once you understand what happened first, the 6 bodies don't feel like a mystery anymore. They feel like a receipt. And by the end of this story, you're going to be stuck with the same question Harlem argued over for decades. When the law refuses to see you as human, is vengeance still a sin, or is it the only language power understands? Before Harlem whispered about a pickup truck, there was a man the city wouldn't have remembered at all if the wrong people hadn't decided to make an example out of him. His name was William Jackson. Not a headline name, not a gangster name, not a name that opened doors, just a working man's name, the kind that gets lost under paperwork and subway noise. William didn't grow up with options. He grew up with labor. The kind that teaches you early that strength isn't a flex, it's a requirement. And when he came north, he didn't come chasing glamour. He came chasing the simplest thing America kept promising and never consistently delivering. A life where nobody could touch you without consequence. New York didn't give him that. New York gave him docks, warehouses, cold mornings, and men who acted like the world belonged to them because their skin matched the system. Back then, you could be in the right and still be in danger. You could be quiet and still get picked. You could be hardworking and still be treated like a threat. And that's the first open loop you need to keep in your head, because it's where the story actually starts. How does a man go from invisible worker to the single person a Harlem kingpin would later risk a war to avenge? It happens fast. It happens in one moment, the kind of moment that decides the rest of your life before you even realize you're standing in it. One night, behind the warehouses, William got cornered. Not because he stole something, not because he disrespected someone, but because he existed in the wrong place while black. A small pack of men, loud, confident, the kind of confidence people get when they believe the law will look away. William fought back. Not like a hero in a movie, like a man who understands that if you go down, nobody's coming to lift you up. He didn't win clean. He didn't lose clean. He just refused to be helpless. And that's when a stranger walked into the edge of the scene. A man with a calm posture that didn't match the danger, the kind of calm that tells you he's seen worse and doesn't fear worse. A man who didn't rush, didn't yell, didn't bargain. He simply made the situation expensive. That man was Bumpy Johnson. And people misunderstand this part about Bumpy. They think power is always loud. They think it's shouting and violence and showing off. But real power in the street has a different tone. It's quiet. It's controlled. It's the feeling that if you make the wrong move, you won't get a second chance to regret it. Bumpy didn't know William personally. That's what makes what happened next matter. Because Bumpy didn't step in like a savior. He stepped in like a man enforcing a rule Harlem lived by, because the city didn't protect them the way it protected others. You don't jump one of ours and walk away like it's nothing. That was the rule. And once Bumpy drew a line in the dirt, everybody in that alley understood something. The situation had changed, not because Bumpy was the law, but because Bumpy represented the cost of ignoring it. The men backed off, not because they suddenly became good people, because they recognized the look in Bumpy's eyes, the look that says, "I will remember your face, and you will wish I didn't." William stood there, breathing hard, injured but upright, thinking this was over. Bumpy knew better, because the first attack is rarely the final one. The first attack is the test, the second attack is the punishment if you survive the test. So Bumpy told him a version of the truth nobody else was telling him. If they came once, they'll come again, and next time, they'll bring more. Then he offered William a choice that didn't feel like a choice. Stay alone and keep rolling the dice, or step under a shadow big enough to make people think twice. This is where William becomes important, because William doesn't respond like someone looking for trouble. He responds like someone who's tired of being hunted. He doesn't ask for money first, he asks what the protection costs. And Bumpy gives him the only price that ever truly mattered in Harlem: loyalty. Not the fake kind, not the say you're loyal when it's convenient kind. The kind where you stand when standing is dangerous, and right there, in that alley, you can feel the story locking into place. Two men who were never supposed to be connected become linked by a rule and a promise. And now I'm going to give you the second open loop, the one that turns this from crime story into tragedy. Because years later, when everything goes bad, when the city closes its eyes, when the paperwork moves too fast, there's going to be a sentence that haunts this entire story. Nobody puts their hands on you again. That promise is going to matter. Not because it sounds tough, because once you say something like that to a man who has never been protected a day in his life, you've given him something people will die for. But life doesn't let them settle into the relationship yet, because history hits the timeline like a hammer: war. And William, the same man who just wanted peace, ends up chasing something else that sounds noble and turns out to be complicated. Proof. Proof that he belongs. Proof that sacrifice equals respect. He leaves New York wearing a uniform, and when he comes back, he finds out the uniform doesn't change what certain people think he is. War has this lie baked into it, the idea that if you bleed for a flag, you come home owning a piece of the country. That if you survive what should have killed you, the world has to respect you afterward. William believed that lie, at least at first. He didn't go to war chasing a medal, he went chasing a verdict. A final answer to a question America forced black men to ask every day: am I a man here, or am I only useful when I'm silent? So when the draft notice arrived, William didn't run from it. He stepped into it. And this matters because it tells you who he was: not reckless, not romantic, just determined to earn what should have already been his. He left New York and got placed where so many black soldiers were placed back then. in units expected to do the hardest work while being treated like the lowest value. Even in uniform, the rules didn't disappear. They just changed costumes. William learned discipline the way you always learn discipline, by almost dying. The first time you underestimate chaos. He learned to read rooms and doorways and rooftops. He learned to hear danger before it arrived, and somewhere between training and combat, the dock worker became something else. A man who didn't panic. A man who moved when others froze. A man who understood that hesitation costs lives. Years later, when people in Harlem would call him solid, they weren't talking about his size. They were talking about that war-built calm, the calm that makes violent men uncomfortable because they can't predict you. William comes home in late 1945 with that calm in his body and a quiet pride in his chest. Not loud pride, not look at me pride. The kind of pride a man carries when he did what he was asked to do, and did it well, and expects, at minimum, to be treated like a human being for it. And then New York reminds him what he really is to them. He finds out fast that the city doesn't care what you survived overseas if the people in charge still don't like what you are at home. The uniform doesn't protect you from a bus driver's eyes, a restaurant's refusal, a cop's mood. This is the point where William's internal war begins, because it's one thing to be disrespected as a worker. It's another thing entirely to be disrespected as a soldier who just came back from doing the country's dirty work. That contradiction breaks something in him. Not into violence, into exhaustion, into that quiet, dangerous feeling of being done begging. And the city does what the city always does to men like that. It lets them slip. No safety net, no dignity, no thank you. Just cold sidewalks and long nights. Harlem had bright lights, music, laughter spilling out of clubs, and right behind those lights were alleys where reality waited like a tax. And that's where William ends up. Not because he's weak, because he's alone. Now here's where the story bends back into Bumpy's orbit. And it's not by coincidence, it's by consequence, because promises have weight in Harlem, especially when the world is built to make you feel weightless. One night, after a late hour, Bumpy is leaving his club, moving through Harlem like he owned the air. Men nodded, doors opened, street corners made space. That's how power looks when it's accepted, not announced. And then he sees a shape tucked away from the light, a man trying to disappear. But Bumpy notices the detail other people miss. A glint, a small shine catching streetlight, metal on a torn jacket. A soldier's proof hanging on a man the city is trying to erase. Bumpy steps closer and recognizes him, the dock worker from years ago, the man he pulled out of a corner. William wakes like a soldier, fast, alert, and then relaxes the moment he realizes who it is. Because even after years, that alley memory still carries one fact. Bumpy didn't watch him get hunted. Bumpy asks the obvious question, and William answers with the kind of honesty you only give when you've stopped performing strength for strangers. He has nowhere to go. The war didn't fix America. It just added scars. Bumpy doesn't lecture him, doesn't pity him, doesn't offer charity like he's doing William a favor. Instead, Bumpy does something colder, something more binding. He reaches into his pocket and pays for a room. Not one night, not a handout. Enough time for William to stand back up without panic breathing down his neck. And then Bumpy speaks the sentence that turns this into a chain reaction. He reminds William of the promise. He treats it like a debt, not because Bumpy is soft, because Bumpy's reputation is built on something most people don't understand. In Harlem, your word is your identity. If your word breaks, your power cracks. So Bumpy tells William he's coming to work, not as decoration, not as a mascot, not as a look what I did for you, as protection, as someone trusted enough to stand close. And William doesn't celebrate. He doesn't smile like it's a movie rescue. He just nods, because for the first time in a long time, the future stops looking like a hallway with no doors. Now, I need you to hold on to this third open loop, because it's the one that sets up everything that follows. When you put a war-trained man next to a kingpin, you don't just gain protection, you gain attention. People notice, enemies notice, rivals notice, and the most dangerous people in New York aren't always the ones with the loudest reputations. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who hate you quietly. and wait patiently for a clean opportunity. William becomes Bumpy's shadow. And in the next section, you're going to see why Bumpy started trusting him fast, not because William looked tough, but because William noticed things other men didn't. He catches a problem before it becomes a headline, and that's when the countdown really starts. Because every time William saves Bumpy, someone else feels humiliated. And humiliation is the seed of the kind of revenge that doesn't miss. When William steps into Bumpy's world, the first thing he learns is that danger in Harlem rarely announces itself like danger in war. In war, you listen for the obvious, the gunfire, the movement, the wrong silence. In Harlem, danger wears a smile, carries a tray, offers a handshake, laughs too loudly at the wrong joke. It blends into the room and waits for you to relax, and that's why William's value shows up fast. Because he doesn't just look intimidating, he watches. He reads people the way he used to read streets overseas: posture, eyes, hands, exits, timing. Most bodyguards are there to scare people. William is there to notice what fear looks like before it becomes action. The first time it happens, it's in a place that feels safe because it's familiar. Music, crowded tables, warm light, the kind of Harlem night where the city almost pretends it isn't cruel. Bumpy is doing what he always does, sitting where everyone can see him. That's not arrogance, that's strategy. A kingpin hides when he's weak. A kingpin is visible when he wants the room to remember who it belongs to. William stands behind him, calm, silent, scanning. And then he catches a detail that doesn't belong. Not a weapon, not a suspicious coat, a tremor, a man whose hand doesn't match his confidence, a person trying to act normal while their body betrays them. People think tension looks like anger. In reality, it looks like over-control, a waiter who moves too carefully, a bartender who won't make eye contact, someone who keeps checking the same door like they're already planning the sprint. William clocks it instantly. And this is the difference between him and everyone else in the room. He doesn't need proof to move. He needs probability. He doesn't wait for the sip. He doesn't let the moment become irreversible. He interrupts it. Not with a speech, not with drama. With a simple, immediate action that breaks the plan before the plan can breathe. The room freezes for 1 second. That fragile second when everybody senses something happened but nobody knows what it means yet. And then the truth spills out. The person in the room wasn't serving drinks. They were serving an ending. Now here's the part most stories get wrong. The first save doesn't make William feel proud. It makes him feel certain that he was right to stay sharp and certain that the people circling Bumpy aren't playing games. Because attempts like that aren't random. They're messages. And messages always have senders. That night doesn't end with applause. It ends with consequences moving quietly through Harlem. Because in Bumpy's world, when someone tries to take your life, you don't just stop the attempt. You remove the person who thought they could attempt it. And that removal has an effect that matters more than the immediate danger. It embarrasses someone. Somebody paid for that move. Somebody planned it. Somebody believed it would work. And when it fails, somebody feels exposed. That feeling, exposure, is gasoline. It pushes people into mistakes. It turns patience into urgency. It turns maybe later into now. This is where the camera needs to widen. Because while William is proving himself, another group is watching from outside Harlem, looking in with a specific kind of hatred. Not just racial hatred, but territorial hatred, the kind that comes from believing a neighborhood is a hunting ground. In those years, you had crews that treated borders like business. They weren't thinking in terms of right and wrong. They were thinking in terms of permission. Who's allowed to operate where? Who's allowed to collect? Who's allowed to walk through a block without paying a price? And Bumpy, publicly, loudly, permanently, represented no. So when word spreads that Bumpy now has a war-trained shadow who reacts fast and ruins plans, it doesn't scare those men away. It irritates them. Because to them, William isn't just protection, he's an insult. He's Bumpy saying, I see your moves before you make them. And the more William proves that true, the more they stop focusing on Bumpy and start focusing on William. This is the pivot a lot of people miss. If you can't reach the king, you cut the king's shield. Not because the shield is the real target, but because once the shield is gone, the king is suddenly human again. So they start learning William's patterns, where he stands, when he moves, who he trusts, which doors he uses, which nights he escorts Bumpy personally, and which nights he doesn't. And the second save makes this worse, because it happens in a way that leaves no doubt William is not lucky. He's trained. He's reading the street like a battlefield, spotting the small, wrong reflection, the angle that doesn't make sense, the silent threat hiding above eye level. He moves Bumpy before Bumpy even understands he's in danger. To William, it's instinct. To Bumpy, it's revelation. Because now Bumpy understands something that changes how he feels about this man. William isn't just loyal, he's rare. And rare men become symbols. William becomes a symbol of protection Harlem can trust, a symbol that Bumpy's circle is tightening, a symbol that outsiders can't waltz in and do what they want anymore. Symbols attract worship. Symbols also attract enemies. And right here is the next open loop, the one that makes the tragedy feel inevitable without rushing it. The more William saves Bumpy in public, the more someone is forced to beat William in public. Because these aren't just men trying to kill someone. These are men trying to reassert dominance, and dominance to them is performance. So the planning shifts. Not how do we hit Bumpy, but how do we take William? And when that shift happens, the story stops being about a kingpin with enemies. It becomes about a war hero being hunted in a city that still doesn't believe he deserves to live. Now, in the next section, we're going to step into the night where the third save happens, the one that changes everything. Not because it's the most dramatic, because it creates the single condition William can't fight his way out of, vulnerability. And once William becomes vulnerable, the men watching from outside Harlem finally get what they've been waiting for. A clean shot, not at Bumpy, at the promise. The thing about a third save is that by the time it happens, everyone has already learned the pattern. Bumpy's men have learned William is different. Bumpy's enemies have learned William is a problem. And William has learned that danger doesn't get tired, it just gets smarter. So on the night everything turns, Harlem feels normal on the surface. Music, cars rolling slow, people laughing like tomorrow's promised. Bumpy exits through the back like he always does, not because he's scared, but because routine keeps you alive. William trails him at the same distance as always, close enough to act, far enough to see. And then William catches movement that shouldn't exist. Not the kind you can describe easily, not a clear silhouette holding a weapon in plain sight. More like the air shifts in a way your body recognizes before your brain explains it. A shadow where a shadow shouldn't be. A pause that's too deliberate, two shapes separating from darkness as if they were waiting for that exact second. This time, there's no room for warning, no time for boss move, no time for a dramatic turn. Just physics. William's body moves first because that's what training does. It makes you react before fear can negotiate. He drives Bumpy off the line, and the moment they hit the ground, the street answers with sound. Not chaos, precision, a plan executed, the kind of plan that has been rehearsed. William returns fire in the only way you can when the distance is short and the moment is thin, quick, controlled, meant to create space, meant to end the attempt before it becomes a certainty. The attackers don't stick around for a fair fight. That's another lesson people learn too late. A lot of killers aren't brave, they're opportunistic. When the script changes, they vanish. The alley goes quiet again, but it's not the same quiet. Because William's breathing changes, and Bumpy notices it. Now, here's where I'm going to slow down, not for drama, but because this is the hinge of the entire story. William doesn't collapse like a movie character. He doesn't deliver a speech and die beautifully under streetlight. He stays up. He stays focused. He checks Bumpy first, because that's his job, and because, in William's mind, jobs are sacred. He's the kind of man who treats responsibility like religion. Only after he confirms Bumpy is still breathing does he finally acknowledge the cost in his own body. And for the first time since William came back from war, he's forced into something he hates, being the one who needs help. They move him fast, quiet. Not to a public hospital where questions live, but to someone discreet, someone safe, someone who doesn't call the police and turn a man into a report. This is when the enemy's patience pays off. Because the men outside Harlem weren't just trying to kill Bumpy that night. They were testing William. They wanted to force one outcome, separation. They wanted William away from the crowd, away from backup, away from the protective noise of Bumpy's world. Even if the hit fails, if William is injured, he has to rest somewhere. And rest is the one thing you can't do with your eyes open. So while Harlem sleeps, another kind of meeting happens, the kind in cheap places with expensive hatred. A small crew, white, out of neighborhood, men who measure their pride in how many times they can cross a line and not get punished. They hear the news. Bumpy lived, but William is down. And to them, that is the first good news they've had in weeks, because it means the shield is exposed. Now, listen carefully, because this part is where your whole documentary gets its why. Those men don't do what they do because they're bored. They do it because they believe the city will excuse it. They believe the system has already proven over and over that certain lives matter less, especially when the victim is easy to dismiss and the perpetrators are hard to touch. That belief is what gives them courage. And if you want to make this a 50-minute narration that hits hard, you don't just frame them as villains. You frame them as a product of a time and a city that taught them they could get away with it. So they don't plan something quick. They plan something that restores their pride. Something that says, you embarrassed us. Something that says, Harlem doesn't get to win. And the sickest part is how practical their thinking becomes, not about morality, but logistics. Where is William? How many guards? Which door? What hour? The kind of questions predators ask when they've already decided a man is meat. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn, because the most painful tragedies don't happen in broad daylight with cameras rolling. They happen in the hours when decent people are asleep, and the city is cold, and the only witnesses are windows with curtains drawn. William is resting, injured, sedated enough that his body can heal. And that's not weakness. That's human. But it creates the one condition his enemies needed, a moment where the war hero can't fight like a war hero. Now the final open loop for this section, the one that pulls viewers into the next chapter. If Bumpy is as powerful as Harlem says he is, how did they get to William anyway? Because that question has an answer. And the answer is not, Bumpy didn't care. It's worse. The answer is, the system didn't care, and the streets can't guard every door in a city designed to break you. In the next section, we're going to walk into the night William is taken, without turning it into gore, without turning it into fantasy. We're going to focus on what matters, the humiliation, the message, and the moment Harlem realized the law had officially stepped out of the story. And once that happens, the neighborhood writes its own ending. What happened to William didn't become a headline the way it should have. That's not because it wasn't horrific. It's because the city had already decided what kind of story it wanted this to be. And when a city decides the ending first, it rewrites the middle to fit. Late night bleeds into early morning. Harlem is quieter, but not peaceful. There's a difference. In the kind of neighborhoods where people have learned to survive, quiet is often just caution wearing a blanket. William is resting in a place chosen for discretion, not because anyone is doing anything wrong, but because experience teaches you one brutal truth. When you don't trust the system to protect you, you stop inviting the system into your emergencies. And for a few hours, it almost works. Almost. Because outside that room, the men who have been circling finally stop circling. They move. They don't come like movie villains with speeches. They come like people who've already practiced the route in their heads. Boots on stairs, a door tested, a lock forced. A plan that relies on speed and surprise. Because speed and surprise are what predators use when they don't want a fair fight. William wakes. Not fully, not at his best, but enough to understand what's happening. And that's the part that matters most here. He understands. He understands that this isn't just an attack. It's a statement. They aren't trying to win. They're trying to degrade. They want him scared. They want him begging. They want a war-trained man to feel powerless, because that's the only way they can feel powerful. So they take him. And what they do after that isn't about killing. It's about performing cruelty. The old kind, the kind that was designed not just to end a life but to send a message to every witness who will never testify. By the time the night releases him back to the city, William is gone. Not just dead, erased in the way people get erased when the world decides their suffering is acceptable. And here's the line that turns a tragedy into a breaking point. When help finally comes, when authorities finally touch the edges of the story, the system does what the system has always done in moments like this. It gets impatient, it simplifies, it labels, it files. Instead of seeing a war veteran who survived a foreign battlefield and got hunted on his own streets, the city treats William like a problem that needs to be closed. And the closure is the insult that Harlem never forgave. A report that implies this was just another street incident, just another gang situation, just another reason to shrug. No deep urgency, no public outrage, no serious pursuit of the men who did it, because it's not only that William was black, it's that the men who took him weren't the kind of men the city liked holding accountable back then, not when the victim was easy to dismiss and the case could be buried quietly without consequences. That's the moment Harlem stops expecting justice. Not because Harlem is cynical, because Harlem is observant. And now the story returns to Bumpy, not as a gangster, not as a legend, but as a man with something most powerful people don't have, a personal bond that made this loss feel like an attack on the neighborhood's soul. The news reaches him the way bad news always reaches kings, not gently. A man bursts in, breath short, face drained, words stumbling over themselves because the truth is too ugly to carry smoothly. It's William. William is gone. And for a few seconds, the room goes quiet in a way that scares everybody. Because Bumpy doesn't explode right away. He doesn't yell. He doesn't throw a glass. He goes still. And if you've ever been around dangerous men, you learn something. Rage is loud, but decision is quiet. Bumpy asks for one thing first, not sympathy, not prayers, names. Because grief in Harlem isn't just sadness, it's responsibility. When someone is taken like that, the neighborhood doesn't ask, how do we cope? It asks, who did it, and what do they think they just proved? Bumpy goes to see William's body. And I'm not going to turn this into gore, because you don't need gore to understand devastation. You just need one image. The medals, the symbol, the proof that William did everything a country told him to do and still got treated like he was worth nothing. Bumpy stands there longer than anyone expects, long enough for the people around him to start feeling fear, not fear of an enemy, but fear of what Bumpy is about to become. Because up to this point, Bumpy's power has been transactional. Territory, money, negotiations, favors, pressure. But this is personal. And personal power is different. Personal power doesn't negotiate. It doesn't accept compromises. It doesn't care about balance. It only cares about consequence. Bumpy walks out of that room, and the first thing he says isn't dramatic. It's cold. It's administrative. It's the kind of sentence that changes a city's weather. Get me the names. And when the names arrive, they come like a small list. Small enough to memorize, small enough to keep in your pocket, small enough to turn into a mission, a crew, outsiders, men who celebrated what they did because they believed nobody would touch them for it. And then Bumpy says the second sentence, the sentence that tells you the law is no longer part of the story. The police closed it, so we won't open it through them. We'll open it our way. Now, here's the key shift you need to feel going into the next section. Bumpy isn't planning revenge like a hot-headed man trying to feel better. He's planning a demonstration, a lesson, a public consequence that travels farther than bullets. Because if the system can quietly erase a war hero, Bumpy understands he has to do the opposite. He has to make the response so unforgettable that even people who hate Harlem will remember to fear Harlem. And this is where the legend splits into two paths. Because some people say what happens next was real, some say it was whispered into existence, and some say the truth is buried somewhere between. But everyone agrees on one thing. After William, something changed. The next move wasn't about one man's grief. It was about Harlem sending a message the city refused to send. In the next section, we're going to walk into the night Bumpy goes hunting. Not with chaos, but with structure. And you'll see why people didn't just fear him afterward. They respected the policy. By the time Bumpy has the names, Harlem is already holding its breath, not because people doubt he'll respond, because they know how he responds matters more than whether he responds. There's a difference between retaliation and policy. Retaliation is heat, fast, messy, emotional. Policy is cold, deliberate, repeatable, meant to outlive the moment. And what Harlem needed after William wasn't a random burst of violence that would get dismissed the same way his death got dismissed. Harlem needed a consequence the city couldn't shrug off. Now, this is where the story splits, because what happens next is told two ways. The official world doesn't give you a neat signed confession, but the streets tell you something else, something passed down as warning, as folklore, as don't ever forget what happened when they crossed that line. So I'm going to tell it the way Harlem tells it, not as a court transcript, but as a message people believed enough to change their behavior for years. Bumpy doesn't move that same night. That's the first detail that scares the right people. He waits. Because waiting means you're thinking. Waiting means you're planning. Waiting means you're not acting out of pain. You're acting out of purpose. He calls in his closest men, not the loudest, not the most reckless, but the ones who understand discipline. Men who can keep their mouths shut. Men who can follow a plan without improvising it into a disaster. He doesn't say much. He doesn't have to. He places the names down like a list of debts. And then he asks questions that sound simple but aren't. Where do they drink? Where do they feel safe? Where do they go when they're not pretending to be tough? Because that's where you catch a man, not when he's hunting, but when he thinks the hunt is over. The answers come back quick. A place on the west side. A spot where outsiders gather, laugh loud, and treat the city like it belongs to them. And one detail matters more than all the rest. They're celebrating. Not hiding. Not nervous. Celebrating. That tells Bumpy everything he needs to know about what they believe. They believe Harlem can be hurt without consequence. They believe the system already proved it. They believe William's death was the end of the story. So Bumpy does something that seems small, but it's the heart of the plan. He chooses symbolism. If you want a response that lasts longer than a week, you don't just punish men. You punish an idea. And the idea that needs to die tonight is simple. We can do this and walk away. So Bumpy's plan isn't built to be quick. It's built to be unforgettable. He doesn't want a rumor that fades. He wants a lesson that travels. He wants the kind of story that makes men check themselves in mirrors and see fear behind their own eyes. He orders a vehicle. Not because he needs it, because he wants the method to speak. Because when cruelty is copied back to the people who used it first, it flips the power in a way bullets never can. He's not just punishing killers, he's reversing a ritual. And right there, you can feel Harlem understanding what's coming, not with joy, not with bloodlust, but with that grim recognition that the city refused to do what it should have done. So Harlem is about to watch Harlem solve it. Bumpy's men move out in silence. No sirens, no shouting, no announcement, just cars rolling like shadows with people inside who aren't nervous, because nervousness is for men who don't believe in their own power. They arrive near the spot where the crew is drinking. And here's another detail that makes this feel less like chaos and more like execution. Bumpy's men don't rush in screaming. They seal the space, front, back, exits, corners. It's not a brawl, it's containment, because Bumpy doesn't want a shootout. A shootout is noisy and random and makes the story about who fired first. Bumpy wants the story to be about something else, certainty. And when the door finally opens, the room doesn't fill with gunfire. It fills with realization, the kind of realization that hits men in the stomach when they understand they miscalculated who they were dealing with. The crew reaches for confidence first, that old habit of posture and insults. Then they reach for weapons. And by the time they reach, it's too late. Because Bumpy didn't come for a fair fight. He came to make sure there was no fight at all. That's what a real trap looks like. A moment where the target suddenly understands that every option they thought they had has already been removed. Now, Bumpy walks in, and the room changes temperature. Not because he's the loudest man there. Not he isn't. but because he's the man everyone in that room knows has the will to go past the line other men only talk about. He looks at them one by one. He doesn't spit. He doesn't rant. He doesn't give them the dignity of his rage. He simply makes them feel something worse. Small. And then he brings out the one object that turns this from street business into something holy. A symbol. A piece of William that shouldn't have had to become evidence in the first place. Bumpy holds it long enough for the room to understand the point. This isn't about money. This isn't about territory. This is about what you did to a man who wore his belief in America on his chest and got punished for it. And Bumpy finally speaks, not like a gangster, but like a judge who has already decided the sentence. He tells them in plain language what the city refused to say. You didn't just kill a man. You tried to prove he was nothing. You tried to prove Harlem couldn't protect its own. And now you're going to learn what that costs. Then he gives them the most terrifying promise anyone can give you. Tonight you're not disappearing quietly. Tonight you're becoming a message. Now, this is where I'm going to keep it responsible. Different versions of Harlem's story describe different details of what happened next, and some of those versions are told for shock value. But every version agrees on the core truth. Bumpy did not let this be quick. He did not let this be private. He made sure the method matched the insult so the lesson could never be misunderstood. And the scariest part? It wasn't the act itself. It was what happened around it. People saw enough to know what it meant. And still, nobody stepped in. Not because they loved violence, but because they recognized the original sin. What happened to William was so foul, so cowardly, that the neighborhood decided the law had forfeited its authority. So the city watched, through windows, through door cracks from half-lit corners, and chose silence. And silence in New York is never empty. Silence is consent. Silence is fear. Silence is a community saying, we are not protecting the people who did that. By the time the night ends, Harlem has its answer. Not an official answer, a street answer, a remembered answer. And the next morning, the most chilling part isn't the bodies or the rumors. It's the paperwork. Because the same system that moved fast to close William's case moves strangely fast again, as if closing the file is safer than opening the truth. And this is the final open loop before the last stretch of your video. If the city didn't see what so many people whisper they witnessed, what does that say about who New York was designed to protect in 1946? The morning after a night like that, New York does what it always does. It pretends nothing happened. Not because nothing happened, but because acknowledging it would mean admitting something the city hates. Admitting that there are moments when the system loses control of the narrative. And when control slips, the city reaches for the fastest tool it has: paper, reports, labels, a file with a neat title that ends the conversation before it begins. So the official language shows up again, the same bland words that can flatten any horror into something manageable. Unidentified, unknown, gang-related, no witnesses. And that's the part that makes people whisper, decades later, that this wasn't just fear. It was permission. Because in Harlem's version of events, the streets weren't the only ones who chose silence. The authorities did too, and they did it with speed that feels less like incompetence and more like relief. Relief that they didn't have to look too hard. Relief that the story could be sealed before it turned into a headline they couldn't control. And here's where I need to be clear. Because this is where a good documentary earns trust. Not every detail of this story survives in public record in a clean, provable way. Bumpy Johnson is a real figure with well-documented history and influence in Harlem's underworld. But the specific incident as Harlem tells it, names, route, method, the too fast investigations, all of it, lives in that gray space where street history often lives, passed down as a warning, repeated because it explains the behavior that followed. So whether you see it as literal fact, embellished truth, or a legend built around a real fear, the aftermath is what makes it matter. Because after that winter, something changed in the way people moved. It wasn't just that outsiders became cautious. It was that boundaries hardened. In criminal worlds, territory is usually negotiated with money, meetings, favors, and quiet understandings. But every now and then, A boundary gets written in a way that doesn't need negotiation. A boundary written with consequence. And once that kind of boundary exists, you don't need to enforce it every day. You only need the story to be believable enough that people don't want to test it. That's how legends work. Not by being perfectly documented, by being perfectly effective. Word traveled the way it always travels in New York, fast, distorted, and still accurate in the only way that matters, in its conclusion. Don't touch Harlem's people and assume the city will protect you. Don't humiliate a man and assume it ends with him. Don't confuse silence with weakness, because the streets hear silence differently. Silence means the neighborhood is calculating. Silence means someone is deciding. Silence means you might be walking around right now thinking you're safe, while a consequence is being assembled. This is why the story stuck, because it offered Harlem something the system refused to offer William. A sense that his life had weight. A sense that what was done to him wasn't normal. A sense that someone looked at a war-tested man broken by a country that didn't love him back and said the sentence that every abandoned community eventually learns to say, if the law won't defend us, we will. Now step back and look at what the story is really about. It's not about a kingpin being feared. It's about what happens when a country asks for sacrifice but won't grant dignity. It's about a man who did everything right and still found himself treated like he was disposable. And it's about the terrifying clarity of what fills the gap when justice doesn't arrive. Because when the system fails completely, the only justice left is the kind built by people who aren't trained to be fair. They're trained to be final. And if you're listening to this and thinking, revenge isn't justice, you're not wrong. But here's the harder question this story forces you to ask when a war hero is destroyed and the city closes the file. Like it's nothing. What options are you leaving the neighborhood? That question is why Harlem kept the legend alive. Not because people love violence, because people love the feeling that their lives matter enough for consequences to exist. So however you judge Bumpy, however you judge what Harlem claimed happened, the lesson is the same. The system can be powerful, but memory is powerful too. And Harlem remembers. If this story made you uncomfortable, good. That means you felt the point of it. Because history isn't only what gets printed, it's also what communities are forced to memorize when the official world refuses to protect them. If you want more stories like this, where we separate what's documented, what's disputed, and what the streets swear is true, hit subscribe, because this channel is about the stories history books either sanitized or skipped. Drop a comment with your verdict. Was this justice, vengeance, or a community doing what it had to do when the system walked away? And if you've heard a different version of this story, different names, different details, share it. That's how street history survives.